Alright, now that we've got Singer's analysis a little bit clearer and we've got a better understanding of how this shift occurred from a cardiopulmonary standard to a brain-based standard of death, that in itself is a pretty significant move because we're moving away from strictly bodily notions to the brain that has this element of consciousness attached to it. Now we want to look at another standard of or definition of death that you might think is pretty attractive, but that David de Grazia is going to argue is actually not a good definition at all. This is not a further step that we could take. And this is the higher brain standard of death. De Grazia more or less agrees with Singer's assessment of how we arrived at the whole brain standard. He's less critical of the whole brain standard, and that's not really his focus. His focus is on addressing individuals who think that this whole brain standard actually doesn't go far enough. Some people have argued that we should go even further in the direction of a brain-based criteria and adopt what they call a higher brain standard of death. And according to that standard, death is the irreversible cessation of consciousness. Now, notice the difference there. It's not the irreversible cessation of all brain functioning, but only a particular kind of brain functioning necessary for consciousness. So on the higher brain standard, if you are permanently unable to regain consciousness, you are dead, right? And that's different from saying, oh, we should terminate life supportive services or something like that. You might think that that's a legitimate position. Who knows? So that's sort of not something we're getting into here. What de Grazia is talking about is folks who want to say, no, people in that state are dead already. Like, if you keep them on some sort of supportive device, you're feeding a corpse, basically. Those people are dead. This is why it was important that we talked a little bit about the difference between whole brain death and persistent vegetative states, because unlike the whole brain standard, where people in persistent vegetative states still count as alive, on this view, people in persistent vegetative states are dead. Now, before we get into the arguments, I do this every now and then with a particularly complicated article, and this is definitely a tricky one. De Grazia is a pretty good writer, pretty clear, but there's just a lot happening here. So I think it's helpful that from the outset we identify what I think are his two main points. First, he wants to challenge the higher brain standard. He's going to argue that it's both theoretically and practically problematic, and it should not be adopted by the medical community. So medicine should resist this push towards a higher brain standard of death, because it's just got all kinds of problems. However, de Grazia thinks that we can reject the higher brain standard without certain kinds of problematic implications. Like, he doesn't think that this should imply that people in irreversible coma should be kept on life support indefinitely. For example, he doesn't think that rejecting the higher brain standard has those implications. He's not saying that, look, everyone in a persistent vegetative state should stay on a respirator for 20 years or anything like that. He thinks, in general, the connection between how we define death and policies about things like life support and organ procurement aren't quite as strong as people think that they are. And this is the part starred at the bottom. Usually stars are supposed to indicate sort of especially important points. Here's how de Grazia's argument is going to go. He says there are two methodologies for developing a definition of death. We can use what he calls a persons-based methodology, or we can use what he calls a biological methodology. And the higher brain standard is consistent with the persons-based methodology, but it's not consistent with the biological one. So if we opt for the biological methodology, higher brain standard is out. And we'll see in a minute why that's true. But it's important for our purposes for you to note that what de Grazia is trying to do is undermine the underlying methodology that supports the higher brain standard. So his target is the persons-based methodology. He thinks if he can show that that methodology is flawed, the higher brain standard goes away because that's the only methodology that endorses it. And I'll say that again as we work through this lecture, but I want to say it at the outset because it's always the part that people sort of get confused about with this article, is that his target is not the higher brain standard per se, it's this underlying persons-based approach. What de Grazia wants to advocate instead is what he calls a biological approach, a biological perspective on death. He starts with pretty plausible claims. He says, look, everything that's alive also dies. So if what we want to do is define death, we need to figure out what's common to all instances of death across the spectrum of living organisms. We want to figure out what makes plant death and bacteria death and antelope death and human death, what makes all those instances of death, like what unifies the concept. He thinks if we can do that, then we've captured the core meaning of the term, and that's where our definition should follow from, not from these sort of peripheral considerations. And he says, look, we've actually already got a pretty good definition from two philosophers, Bernard Gert and I believe his name is Kevin Culver, but I would double check that. It's not super important who said this anyway. What's important is their definition. They say, death is the permanent cessation of functioning of the organism as a whole. Now, de Grazia says, don't take that literally. Don't get carried away. When we say organism as a whole, it's not as though, if you lose your foot, you're dead, right? Instead, what this refers to is an important set of subsystems that are shared by almost all animals. Only the most primitive animals, amoebas and whatnot, don't have these important subsystems. Those will be systems for something that fulfills the function of respiration, stuff like that. The processes some kind of food source, produces energy for the organism, things like that. It says, like, once that kind of systemic integrated functioning ceases, that's when an organism is dead. And this applies to plants, bacteria, antelope, human, doesn't matter. That's what's common to death. That's the basis of death. And de Grazia says, look, this is actually compatible with both of the current standards, because on the cardiopulmonary standard, when the heart and lungs cease to function, they also cease to support each other, and they cease to support other important bodily systems. So when the heart and lungs stop working, the sort of essential functioning of that set of subsystems is lost, and the organism ceases to function in that sense. On the whole brain standard, because the whole brain standard technically also includes the patient's brainstem, with the brainstem no longer orchestrating bodily functions, that integrated functioning of these subsystems is again going to occur, or is going to fail. And so on that whole brain standard, when taken literally in the way that it actually is written, that's also going to be consistent with this biological perspective. Because in either case, what's being appealed to is the role of certain organs to the overall functioning of the whole organism. However, this standard is not compatible with the higher brain definition of death, because PBS patients still have coordinated functioning of the major systems of their body. They still have brainstem activity. So they're still capable of respiration, they're still moving blood about the body, they're still taking care of their waste. So the sort of living system is still working on the higher brain standard. And the biological definition says that's not death. Death is when the sort of core subsystems stop functioning together. And that isn't what's happening in the case of the higher brain standard. Just to see this a little bit more clearly, because it's pretty important for de Grazia's overall argument, let's just look at this biological argument against higher brain death. So this argument goes something like this. If higher brain death is the correct definition of death, it has to be consistent with a biological definition of death. So if we start with the biological perspective, the only way that higher brain death can be correct is if it fits with that biological perspective. But individuals with higher brain death still have integrated functioning of most of the body's important subsystems. That's what the biological standard says death is. That's the criterion that the other two standards can meet. But individuals with higher brain death don't meet that standard. They still have this level of functioning. Therefore, individuals with higher brain death are not dead from the biological definition of death, so we have to throw that out as the correct definition. So again, notice the methodology. If we take the biological view on death, higher brain death is out because it doesn't meet the standard. What we still need to know, and what de Grazia will spend the rest of the article sort of articulating, is why the biological perspective is the one that we have to opt for. Because there is this alternative, what he calls the person-space perspective. And there are a couple of reasons why someone might, or a couple of arguments someone might give for that person-space perspective. First, they might push on this idea that death has a core meaning, that there's something that's common to all instances of death for living organisms. And that's a fundamental feature of the biological perspective. And you might push back against that and say, no, there's kind of a family resemblance But there's nothing about plant death or bacteria death or antelope death that holds across those. There's nothing about those that's sort of fundamentally the same that would allow us to say, oh, in virtue of that feature there, that's what makes these all a case of death. They're just they're similar in a certain way, but there's no core meaning. The other option is to say that even if there is a core meaning of the term, and any term, in fact, we can reconstruct that meaning in light of practical concerns and certain kinds of changing circumstances. So similar to what the Harvard committee did, right? They didn't say that, look, cardiopulmonary standard is wrong. It's not that it doesn't get at the meaning of death. It's just that there are these practical concerns and new developments that require that we adjust this meaning. DeGrazia thinks that, and he gives an example of this, just if it's not clear kind of what they're getting at. So the term conversation did not evolve in an environment where email or texting was occurring. It seemed to originally require that two people could see and hear one another, or at least hear one another. The phone sort of eliminated the need to see. And now, as things have developed further, we can talk about an email conversation or a text conversation. We're conversing over text. There does seem to be a core meaning of that term conversation, but we can sort of reconstruct the meaning to accommodate new developments. And someone might argue for the person-space perspective along these lines. They might say, look, even if there's kind of a core biological meaning of death, as things change, we can sort of adopt new meanings to accommodate those new developments. Now, I take DeGrazia, he's not super clear about this, but I think his view is that the advocates of the person-space perspective are mostly advocating the second argument, that there is a core meaning to death, but we can sort of fiddle about with it when we need to. Okay. Go ahead and complete the question. It's just about what it means to take a biological perspective on death. It's a good chance for you to sort of check your understanding of this notion and this methodology that DeGrazia is going to be working with. And then we'll look at a couple of persons-based arguments for the higher brain standard.